possible.
I'm Craig LeMoult. Tonight on Greater Boston, the state is stepping in with a new program to identify Massachusetts farmers who are under significant stress and to connect them with mental health resources that can help. I'm joined by the Commissioner of the State Department of Agricultural Resources and the head of a program in Vermont that's the model for the new program here. Then, after a series of hospital failures cost his wife her life, Peter DeMarco devoted himself to making sure that kind of tragedy doesn't happen again. He joins me to discuss new standards for hospital safety and access that are finally set to go into effect. Exasperated by failed crops, rising food and production costs, and labor shortages, farmers in Massachusetts are under a lot of stress these days. And according to a recent survey from the State Department of Agricultural Resources, 95% of respondents say their job impacts their mental health and well-being. To help, the state is launching a new mental health and wellness program to train farmers to spot the signs that someone's struggling and connect them with mental health resources that can help. I spoke to one local farmer who's seen the toll that farm work can take on mental health.
Having anxiety is definitely one of the things that has kept me in farming. When there's literally animals that have to be fed, something else is like depending on me, so I can get out of like my own head a little bit, and it's like I can kind of switch gears, and so I'm not just focusing on myself. There's something else that I have to go take care of. My name's Meg, and I'm a farmer in Middleborough, Massachusetts. The sheep that I raise are Shetland sheep. I can sell them for meat. We shear them every year for their wool. I also sell sheep to people who want to start their own sheep flocks. Breeding for me is like always a stressful time, like when the lambs are being born. I've slept in this barn on many occasions. I've slept in my truck. Come on, pretty girl, you got this. You got this, pretty girl, come on. I have so much anxiety that like, something terrible is going to happen, you know what I mean? So it makes me feel better to feel like I'm in control, and if I'm physically there, to like be able to watch it. I've only had a couple panic attacks as an adult. You get set off, and it feels like almost like water's like washing over you, and you can just feel it. Like it starts at your head, and it sinks down to your toes, and you start to feel a little bit numb, and you start to feel like I can't breathe so good, my heart's racing. There's a lot more talk, like openly, nowadays about mental health than there has been in the past, which I think is the direction that we should all be moving in. People should be honest about where they are. But people who are independent and strong-willed are obviously not going to be the first people to like raise their hand and ask for help. People that are in the agricultural community have a tremendous amount of stress on them. An older gentleman that I know chose to take his life. I mean, honestly, nobody knows like the exact reasons for it. But when you have the stressors of potentially not having access to land or not having access to secure housing, and then on top of that, the weather changes or your animals get sick, it can just be a situation that would break anybody. Some people who farm in rural areas in Massachusetts, like they don't have access to what they would need to help solve those problems. I have seen farmers like at their brink and at their breaking point, and I wish that some of these resources had existed then to share with them.
Appreciate it. We are like stocked.
Yeah,
I know. Well, we're supposed to be.
I do have a great network of farmer friends because I've been working in agriculture for 20 years. So I have lots of people that I can pick up the phone to talk to.
He's like, if you have like a flock of 20 ewes, I would love to consistently buy 12 ram lambs off of you a year.
But if I was a young farmer, if I was new to this area, if I came from a different part of the country, I could see how you would feel extremely isolated and really want to talk to somebody about it. Even just like to know somebody else, like, with a kid who's like farming. I don't know that he has like a lot of connections like this way, so he's wicked nice kid, so.
So it was a really good connection, and I just wanted to say thank you.
So we're still on roller skating? Is that part of it?
Yeah.
Okay.
7 o'clock? We can go now too.
One person said to my daughter one time, like, oh, you're so lucky that like your mom works on this beautiful farm. And my daughter said, the animals always eat dinner before we do, you know? So every day on the farm is not romantic. It's not always fun. It's not always fun for your plans to have to get canceled or changed because an animal got sick or something's dying. And, you know, having the state step in and recognize that this is an issue that they want to support and that they want to try to help. It's just my hope that this commitment like actually can make a difference in some people's lives.
To discuss more, I'm joined now by Ashley Randle, Commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources, and Karen Crowley, Program Manager with Farm First, an organization sponsored by the state of Vermont that's providing farmers and their families there with support and resources to help with stress. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Craig.
Thank you.
So, Commissioner, the new program was launched after your department conducted a survey of farmers in the state. 55% of the respondents said they have anxiety. Nearly half reported feeling nervous or on edge. And they said about a third said they are not able to control their worrying. Was that result surprising to you?
I would say, Craig, somewhat surprising, but based on the stressors that farmers face on a daily basis, we know that climate change and the weather impacts of the past few years certainly have impacted them, labor shortages, inflation now that we've seen, and growing up on a fifth-generation dairy farm, I could really relate to those farmers and the stressors that they noted they were experiencing.
Yeah, they actually, in the survey, listed out some of the things that were most stressful to them. They included the weather was one of the key things. They can't control that. Certainly, there were other factors like the stressful working conditions, financial stress, labor shortages. I mean, a lot of these things are things I think that would stress anybody out, but especially for farmers who maybe have, who are prone to depression or anxiety, I can imagine these could be triggers to something pretty tragic at times.
Yes, and we do hear more and more often that those challenges continue to increase. And coming out of the pandemic, the challenges that the farmers are now facing were further exacerbated with inflation and the costs for inputs on the farm, from feed, fuel, fiber. Everything that goes into production has increased substantially. And when you're trying to provide for your family and your sole income is coming from the farm, the farmers are feeling that weight and that pressure.
What about access to mental health resources? A lot of these farmers are in very rural areas, of course. Do they have the access to the kind of services that would help?
It really depends on the region of the state and how specialized farming is. There's somewhat of a stigma about seeking assistance because oftentimes medical professionals may not understand the unique challenges that farmers are facing. And so there's that cautionary reaching out because they aren't sure that the services that are going to be provided by a mental health professional will actually benefit them.
Karen, you've seen this issue in Vermont for years, especially I think as milk prices have really put a lot of strain and stress on farmers, right? Can you tell us about Farm First, what the program is and why it was created?
Yeah, so Farm First began way back in 2009. We are part of a program called Invest EAP, which is an employee assistance program that serves a lot of Vermont, including the state employees. So the Vermont Agency of Agriculture looked at the services they were getting from an employee assistance program and thought, wow, farmers could really benefit from this type of service. And so Farm First was born. We're able to provide to farmers and their families the services one might expect from an employee assistance program: counseling, stress relief, connection to resources, in order to deal with all of the things that farmers are facing.
Do you know, can you get a sense of how successful this has been in preventing suicides or in just helping farmers in Vermont deal with their mental health issues?
Right. Prevention is always something that's hard to measure because it's hard to know what you can measure that did not happen. But we certainly have seen a lot of suicidal thinking going on, that people are willing to reach out to us and talk through with us. We're able to connect them with the help that they need. It's becoming something that we see more and more often. So we've put a big emphasis on that piece of mental health recently. We judge our success by how our clients feel about us. We've consistently had somewhere between 75 and 100 farmers per year that reach out to us. And sometimes they come back. Oftentimes they'll make referrals to other farmers and their friends. And we've become a very popular and well-known program here in Vermont.
Commissioner, when you got those survey results, you reached out to people in Vermont and worked with them to set up a new program here. Can you speak to me about the program and what you hope to achieve here?
Yes, so the Mass Grown Wellness Program was launched in 2021. We actually received a $500,000 grant from the United States Department of Agriculture through their Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Network. And we had this on our radar for quite a while because we were hearing directly from farmers about their mental health concerns. And so we wanted to develop a program in collaboration with Vermont Farm First because they do have that long storied history of working with the ag community. And so we reached out to them last year, and we actually were able to partner with them to host trainings in January of this year through March, both in person and virtual.
And what are you teaching people in those trainings? What are you telling them to spot?
The 2-hour trainings typically cover self-care, de-escalation strategies, active listening skills. We know oftentimes working in agriculture and in our role at the department, we want to find ways to help farmers. And usually the first question is, how can we help? Without knowing fully all of the circumstances. And with mental health conditions, we want to make sure that we're actively listening. And so through these trainings, we were actually able to work with Vermont Farm First to develop a mental health and wellness toolkit as well.
And I know that part of your plan is you hope to get funding to have a behavioral health specialist who focuses and specializes on working with farmers and maybe understands their unique needs, right? But you got to get the funding through the legislature. It's in the governor's budget, but we're still waiting on the legislature on that?
Correct. So Governor Healy in the FY24 budget did file for the department to have a behavioral health specialist, and currently the legislature has just passed their House budget, and we're still waiting on the Senate version before it ultimately goes to the governor's desk for signature.
Okay, great. And I know you're also working on launching a peer-to-peer network. You're doing that in Vermont right now, right? How is that working, and has that been successful?
That's been an absolutely wonderful and exciting program for us because it's something that we went into not really knowing how well it would work because it's new and it's different. But we got a very enthusiastic response from farmers who stepped up and said, as busy as I am, I want to volunteer my time to spend time with other farmers and kind of take what I've learned and what I've gone through and make their lives easier. I want to give back for all of the people that were supportive of me when I was first starting out. So we've had a great response. We've at this point trained 15 peers in a lot of the same things that we were training in Massachusetts, only their training has been much more intensive. And they are now connecting with other Vermonters and being able to, in whatever ways, it's a very flexible program. Sometimes it's face-to-face, sometimes it's phone calls, but they're able to work out with a peer what they think will be most helpful to them.
Okay. And I know that's what you're working on right now in terms of recruiting those peers in Massachusetts, right?
Yes, that's correct. So the final phase really of our 3-part program is the recruitment to be able to build a peer-to-peer network. And we do have several organizations from the Berkshires to Barnstable County that have already indicated their interest. So we have farmer members, we have organizations that work with farmers, and then members of our team who will also be part of the peer-to-peer network.
In the end, what's your hope?
Our hope is to be able to help farmers. At the department, our goal and our mission is to ensure that Massachusetts agriculture is robust and equitable and safe and secure. And that means our farmers at the end of the day, that their safety and their security is there. And if we can help farmers across the state as well as the peer-to-peer network, be able to identify those signs and save lives. That's the ultimate goal.
Okay. Well, Commissioner Ashley Randle and Karen Crowley, thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, ever since he learned the details of his wife Laura Levis's death in Somerville Hospital and the numerous failures that led to it, Peter DeMarco has been fighting for new regulations to keep what happened to Laura from ever happening again. And now, statewide, changes are starting to go into effect to do just that. Laura died in September 2016 after walking to the hospital to get help for a severe asthma attack. She couldn't tell which entrance was for the hospital emergency department. The one she tried was locked, and her attack worsened too quickly for her to make it to a second door, which just had a small sign in the window identifying the ER. Laura then called 911, but by the time she was transferred to the right dispatcher, she could hardly speak. Hospital staff wouldn't find her until 10 minutes after she made the call, and by then she'd gone into cardiac arrest. 6 days later, Laura Levis, an otherwise healthy, active 34-year-old woman, died of hypoxic brain injury. Peter DeMarco learned of these failures 2 years later and began fighting for accountability and what's become known as Laura's Law, which passed in 2021. The law creates standards for lighting, signage, and other patient access and safety measures for hospitals across the state. Officials finalized regulations to enforce the law a few weeks back. And now hospitals have until the end of the year to comply. Peter DeMarco joins me now, along with Jan Carpman, a wayfinding consultant, architectural sociologist, and a partner at Carpman and Grant Associates. Thank you both so much for being here.
I really appreciate you having us on and sharing the word that people are going to be seeing changes at hospitals when they go to emergency departments, and those changes are becoming pretty soon.
Yeah, right. And can you tell us a little bit about, your experience is just so heartbreaking. You wrote about it so beautifully in the Globe magazine. And since then, you've become really an advocate for this issue, and it's something you've been fighting tirelessly for. What has your experience been like over the last several years trying to make this happen?
Yeah, a lot of work, a lot of ups and downs. After the Globe published Losing Laura, the story I wrote about Laura for the Globe magazine, a 10,000-word story that took up the entire magazine. This is Losing Laura.
It was incredible. I think we all remember this piece. At it was unbelievable and so unbelievably heartbreaking, and also highlighted all of these problems that led to it. It wasn't just a tragedy; it was an avoidable tragedy. It
was avoidable in every single way. Laura had everything that could have gone wrong to go wrong for Laura that morning. From the moment she stepped foot on that hospital campus in Somerville, the signage was confusing. It was dark. There was no emergency sign above any door for her to have gone to. There was no one at the security desk to see her on surveillance camera. And the list goes on. I wrote the story, and I thought that would create change. That people would read this story, they would read about Laura's death, and everything would change. But after there was an initial rush of publicity, and people were outraged, people were upset, but my phone wasn't ringing. So about 2 or 3 weeks after the story came out, and this is in November of 2018, I had to make a decision. It was clear to me that stories themselves don't change things, that people change things. And that's when I made this decision to try to become an advocate, to try to make sure that no one else ever died as she did. And from that, my local representatives, Senator Jalen of Somerville, Representative Barber of Somerville, amazing people. I walked into their office and they said, "What can we do for you? How can we help?" And that's when we filed Laura's Law. And that was more than 4 years ago. It's taken that long to get here.
Why? What took so long?
You know, part of the reason was that it took 2 years to pass the law. During the height of the pandemic, half of the law was passed during the height of the pandemic. Actually, one of the only bills to pass at the end of that session. So the legislative process takes 2 years. That was actually fast, people have told me. People who've fought for changes for years have said, "We can't believe you did this in one try." And as we talked about, the law itself didn't actually direct hospitals to change anything. It ordered the Department of Public Health to create the nuts and bolts regulations. And so the regulatory process is a whole nother game. There's the legislative process to get your bill passed, and then there's a regulatory process. So part of that was also delayed by COVID. We were actually in a state of emergency still when Laura's Law passed. So we were delayed there, and then the regulatory process is slow, it's methodical. You go step by step. There are hearings, there are public hearings. But that's all over now.
Yeah, it happened.
It happened. We're here. It was, you know, I've told a lot of people that who say, "Wow, you did all this, or you helped to do this," and I tell people that don't ever file a bill. Don't ever. It is so difficult. There's so much work. You don't understand what goes into it.
Yeah.
Don't ever file a bill unless you absolutely have to. And, you know, we're talking about Laura. We're talking about my wife, who I loved so dearly, and who should be here today. Yeah. So of course I had to, and I had to stay with it, and I had a lot of help, and that's why we're here today. We finally have regulations as of April 3rd. Hospitals have all the regulations, all these nuts and bolts, directing them on what changes they need to make. And that's an incredible thing to say.
Dr. Carpman, what can we do? How can we make hospitals and hospital ERs easier to find in these moments of crisis where we need them right away?
Yeah, well, there are a bunch of things to do, some at a large scale and some at a small scale. At a large scale, where you locate an emergency department on a hospital campus makes a big difference. If you can see it as you drive up, it's much easier to find it. If it's located around the back or underneath a parking garage or around a corner, it's much harder. So the location, the planning of a site is one thing. And then there are signs that can make a difference, what we call signage now. Getting people into the campus, directing them to the emergency department, and continuing to direct them. We call those reinforcement signs as they go. So there's no place, we call it a decision point, where they have to make a decision where they don't have information about which way to go. They need either go straight, go right, go left. They need that information. And then they need to figure out where to park if they're parking. If they're walking, it's a different story. In any case, they need to get from parking or get on foot to the emergency entrance. The entrance itself needs to be lighted well enough at night, at dusk, during inclement weather, and of course during the day it needs to be legible. And there needs to be an identification sign, easily readable from a distance, with good contrast between the letters and the background that says very clearly emergency. And there are neighborhoods in which it may need to say it in Spanish also, or another language also. So those are some things that can be done. If there is a problem, if they lock the doors at night, it's very important to have an intercom, a two-way intercom, so a patient or a family member can speak with somebody from the emergency department to find out how to get in.
And Peter, those are the kinds of changes that hospitals are now required to make in order to meet the requirements of Laura's Law, right?
Those are exactly what these regulations are about. You know, all of those elements would have helped Laura that night. I think, but also I think all these elements, they sound basic, don't they? Yeah. To have the sign that's clear, to have a directional sign pointing in the right direction, to have someone at a security desk, or at least someone 24-hour surveillance of areas that patients can go to have a GPS point, address point for your emergency department if it's located on a different side of the building than the main hospital entrance, as happens a lot, as happened in Laura's case. The fire department went to a different address when they were called to respond to her 911 call, because that's the only address they had. There was no address for the emergency department. All these things sound simple, but there were no regulations for any of these things. There were no requirements. Hospitals have been left to make these decisions on their own. And for sure, Some hospitals have done terrific jobs at this. But I think as Laura's story shows, and as we all know from personal experience, going to a hospital for the first time, they're confusing places.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think possibly too many hospitals have forgotten to think about what their hospital looks like through a patient's eyes. Yeah. That they think the patient experience starts the moment they hit the registration desk. And they forget that it doesn't. It starts the moment they step foot on their property, and especially when they're in crisis with minutes to spare, sometimes trying to find the right door to the emergency department.
You know, how you find your way during an emergency is different than how you find your way during, you know, a regular situation.
Do you have tips for people who find themselves in this position to get there as quickly as possible?
Well, one tip I would have is to think about it in advance when you're not in an emergency, to figure out what is the nearest emergency room to you, and would there be, if you're having chest pain, would you go to one place? If you're having an asthma attack, would you go to another place, for example? Because not all emergency departments treat all emergencies the same. So that would be one thing. Another would be to find out, would your insurance cover the cost of an ambulance? A lot of people don't take an ambulance when they need to because they're worried about the cost. And again, when you're not in that situation, just to find out what would the cost be so that I know it's covered. If I need to, I can take it. And if you end up walking or driving a car, it's important, I think, to try to find your way under regular conditions, not an emergency, so that you can see where things are, find your way, see this is where I park, this is where I go in. You put that in the back of your mind so that if an emergency comes to pass, you've got some familiarity with it.
Peter, in just the second we have left, can you tell me, after this journey that you've been on, what it feels like now to have this actually going into effect?
You know, it's difficult in ways, of course. This is Laura, this is her death. Talking about her death for 4 years as an advocate has not been easy. I think I'm glad that we're at this point. I'm learning to take people's congratulations, because we, and I say we got some real change made in Laura's name that's gonna help anyone having an asthma attack, a stroke, a heart attack, anyone who's rushing. You know, I've had on my refrigerator since the day I started writing Laura's story, I've had a blueprint of Somerville Hospital's emergency department, which I found during my research. And I've had next to it a little purple sticker, because purple was Laura's color. And I just wrote 3 words on that, and those words were, "Don't let up." And maybe now I can think about taking that down.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. Peter DeMarco and Jan Carpman, thank you so much both for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Craig.
That's it for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm Craig LeMoult. Thanks for watching. Good night.
Next time on Auntie